Welcome to Newcastle Unitarians. Our service this morning is quite a curious title. Who do you think you are? Unitarians. What's that? So you may be familiar with Unitarians, you may not be familiar with Unitarians. You may never have heard of Unitarians until recently, which is not surprising really, because we're quite a small group. But you're most welcome here. And whatever you believe and whoever you are, whoever you love, and whatever your views are, you're welcome here. So relax. We're not going to try and tell you what you to believe or how to act. We're here, hopefully, to discuss how we love. So we light our chalice candle as a warm welcome. Maybe I can get the technology sorted out. Oh, yes. Without getting my fingers burnt. There we are. So we light the chalice to ignite the divine spark of the universe, whose pronouns have always been plural, a co-creation of brilliance and diversity, a tapestry of souls perfected. That's written by somebody called Jamie Yandell. A tapestry of souls perfected. Is that just a dream? Is it possible that we can be a tapestry of souls connected, perfected? I'll start with a quotation. It's a Quaker one, actually. A very early Quaker quotation. It's from a man called Isaac Pennington in 1667. And this is what he said. Our life is love and peace and tenderness and the bearing with one another and forgiving one another and not laying accusations one against another, but praying one for another and helping one another up with a tender hand. I love that expression at the end there, helping one another up with a tender hand. So that's what we're about, to help people to see. Because the world's in a bit of a state, isn't it? I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. So we need every bit of encouragement, every ounce, every bit that we can do for one another to raise one another with a tender hand at this particular time. Is that how you feel? You know, we need something to spark us off, as we saw to ignite the divine spark of the universe, as we saw in our chalice reading. One of his fellow Quakers of the same period was William Penn, who went out and founded Pennsylvania. And one of his famous expressions is, "Let us see what love can do." It's both a challenge and a statement to see what love actually can accomplish. And we hope to convince you that it can accomplish rather a lot, and hope you'll agree after the service. Or you may disagree, and over coffee we can talk about that too, because that's, as Unitarians, we don't all agree on everything. Isn't that right?
That's true.
And that's okay. Here it's all right. We're not all of the same ilk, and we're not all of the same background, and we're not all of the same culture, and we're not all of the same thinking. There is great diversity amongst us. Now, this service is very much my personal view on Unitarians, as you'll see. And it may not be everybody's in this room, whether it's long-term Unitarians or not. And you might think, oh, that's a bit over the top, that view. Well, you might think that's rather understated. I don't know. But what I want to suggest to you is that we can all take something from being together this morning. And so, we'd like a story. Let's start with a story. This is Dancing the Yin Yang by Salala Towler. And Janice is going to read it for us.
It's called Dancing the Yin Yang. Once upon a time, an old man and a young boy journeyed together up a mountain. The boy was full of innocence and impatience, and the old man was filled with experience and quietude. The boy was at the beginning of a great adventure. The old man was near the end of a long and arduous journey, one that he had begun many years before, and that had been filled to overflowing with experiences that he would never have been able to describe to another. The boy was restless and wandering. Every little butterfly sent him chasing perilously close to the cliff's edge. The old man was solid and resigned, yet still amused and entertained by the boy's reckless abandon. As they reached the top of the mountain, they met an old woman and a young girl climbing up from the other side. They shared the common characteristics of the boy and the old man. The girl was young and full of youthful vigor and vitality. The old woman was wise and serene, yet still able to smile easily and laugh heartily. They too had been on a long and at times perilous journey, and they too were now at the end of their quest. Upon reaching the summit of the mountain, the old man, young boy, old woman, and young girl all sat down to rest together in the shade of an ancient and gnarled oak tree. They sat together and looked out over the valley spread before them like a painting from the Tang dynasty. The old woman looked over at the young girl and smiled, and the old man looked over at the young boy and grinned. Then they nodded to each other. Words were not needed, and so none were offered. Instead, they all sat there, lost in time, floating in space, while the great birds wheeled overhead and the mountain breezes played with their long hair. Then after a long time, hours, years, eons, they all turned to each other, and after standing, bowed deeply to each other. Then, like a living yin-yang symbol, they began to dance in flowing circles around and within each other. On and on they danced, while the sun slid slowly down over the horizon, then on into the night, under the crystalline star blanket. After a time, they began to merge into each other, till at last there remained only the faintest trace of their presence. A great circle with two entwined fish-like semicircles remained, each giving birth and finding completion in the other. The spiritual remains of the old man and the old woman still flowed endlessly out of and into each other, and the youthful energy of the young boy and the young girl remained there, spinning within the circle of the old man and the old woman. To this day, certain climbers and hikers, those with clear vision and deep insight, have reported a strange and wonderful sight on top of that mountain. Some people say that they have had visions of four people dancing together in a circle, endlessly flowing and melting into each other. Others swear they hear the sounds of laughter and music in the air, coming from somewhere just above their heads. Others feel they have sensed a presence of joy, wisdom, and deep compassion emanating from the very rocks and trees on that mountaintop. Other people, of course, have seen, heard, and felt nothing, only the quiet sound of the wind blowing across the mountain. These are people who dare not dream in the day and do not sleep deeply in the night. They do not fly on the wings of imagination, nor flow with the energy of the universe as it courses through their own bodies. They are, of course, in the majority, yet those who do see, hear, and feel the living yin-yang symbol there on the mountaintop are never quite the same.
Did you enjoy that? Yes, it's lovely, isn't it? And that's what we are, dancing together. It's a lovely symbol. Dance together. Whether you watch Strictly or whatever you watch, when you see two people dancing together in harmony, each weaving and going right. And that is some say, you know, and if you are a Strictly fan, I don't know whether there's any Strictly fans, and or whether there's people in here would admit to being Strictly fans. I don't know. I'm a Strictly fan. I have to admit to that. And you know, and when they get the tens out, you know, the tens go up. That's perfection, isn't it? The movement of one with the other. And that's what we're about to talk about today in this service. How we achieve that level. And here is a poem written by William Herbert Carruth. I've never heard of it. I never heard of him until I started putting the service together. I'm not particularly well read in poetry, so it's not surprising I've never heard of him. This is what he said. Like tides on a crescent sea beach, when the moon is new and thin, into our hearts high yearnings come welling and surging in, come from the mystic ocean, whose rim no foot has trod. Some of us call it longing, and others of us call it God. A picket frozen on duty, a mother starved of her brood, Socrates drinking the hemlock, and Jesus on the rood. And millions who, humble and nameless, the straight, hard path plod. Some call it consecration, and others call it God. But whatever it is that we call it, for me, there's something out there which is mystical, beautiful. But as soon as we start put names to it, we start falling out, don't we? It's a bit like the Tao Te Ching that said that before the beginning of the making of the 10,000 words, there was just one concept, but nobody could actually catch the Tao or God. Now the commentary somewhere here. So there was a commentary about that, about how that, but that's actually a hymn. It's a hymn in one of our books. And this is Kate Wyman, a Unitarian minister from Plymouth, and how she responded to those verses in the hymn. The first Unitarian service that I ever attended included the hymn Others Call It God by William Herbert Carruth. But I was quite unable to sing it. The idea that God might be encountered in the high yearnings of our heart, in a picket frozen on duty or a mother starved for her brood, literally took my breath away and filled my eyes with tears. The words spoke to me of a divine power that finds expression through each one of us when we dare to live fully and fearlessly from the depths of our hearts and souls. When we willingly make sacrifices out of love and concern for others, and when we allow ourselves to be guided by spirit rather than merely by ego. In other words, when we live with integrity. And that's I think I was quite inspired when I saw that expression, what she said about it. what living with integrity means in this time that we're living in, and how we find that integrity. Each of us must find it in a different way, but each of us must try to find it. And I'm back on it, going through the paperwork again. Yes, okay. So, what are Unitarians about? Who are Unitarians? Unitarians pride themselves on their diversity, their difference. Does that sound strange? We don't pride ourselves on being the same, but different, and allowing ourselves to be different. And I have a different take on what it is to be a Unitarian than perhaps some of the other Unitarians in the room might have. That's okay. And that's what we encourage. And the reason why we encourage is, I would say, we're trying to model a new society as Unitarians. And you might think that's a big ambitions for a small group of people meeting here in Newcastle this morning. But it is our ambition that we're modeling what diversity in community can look like, how we can get along with one another, because the world is very diverse, isn't it? And becoming more so. Everywhere we look, we see more and more diversity, not just in colour and culture and class. Everywhere we look, everything is diverse. And in fact, in nature, when we look closely, everything is very diverse, isn't it? And yet we have all these beautiful ecosystems that are able to mould and work with diversity to produce this beautiful, beautiful earth that we live on. And it's all based on cooperation and competition together. It's based on difference and rubbing up one another in the wrong way sometimes. Sometimes, as we rub one another up in the wrong way, we learn more than we do when we come and say, and we're all very pleasant and nice to one another. We learn something about ourselves, don't we, in our response to what's going on. In 2017, the Unitarians had a survey done, and it was looking at who we are as Unitarians. And though it's only on a fairly small sample of Unitarians, I think it was quite suggestive of a lot of Unitarians. I don't know whether anybody in this room actually took part. Louis, maybe and others took part in that survey that took place. And it looked at a whole range of things, the values that Unitarians hold. And on the back of this book, the book was written by Sue Woolley, and it's called Unitarians Together in Diversity. And it points out that on the back, it's quite interesting. Dating back to 450 years and still evolving, Unitarianism is a faith which imposed no creed or dogma on its followers. It is a community of individuals, each on their own spiritual journey, each guided by their own reason and conscience. So what, if anything, binds them together? It sometimes seems to be easy for Unitarians to express what they don't believe rather than to positively affirm what they do believe. So if somebody asks you what's a Unitarian, if you are a Unitarian, I almost guarantee you start, well, we're not this, we don't believe that, and we don't hold to that. Is that true? And we find it much more difficult to say, well, actually, this is what we do believe. This is what we actually are. Interesting, isn't it? So we know from a sales and marketing position, it's very difficult because we don't have a corporate identity. And if you're in sales and marketing, have you ever been in sales and marketing promotion? They're promoting a product. A product seems to have an identity for it to be able to be saleable in our society. So that's perhaps why we haven't heard of Unitarians, because Unitarians find it more and more difficult to speak about their faith. Now, that hasn't always been the case. There have been periods when Unitarians have been quite vocal about their faith, missionary even about their faith. And that's something that Unitarians today think, if you use the word mission, Unitarians mostly will go, no, thank you very much. I don't want anything to do with mission. Maybe you've had a bad experience somewhere before. Maybe you've been come across groups who are very certain about their faith and actually want to push it down into you. And it's a one-off option. You either take it or you leave it. Now, but Unitarians, I believe, and this is why I'm speaking personally, have got something wonderful to offer. That we have something here amongst us that is really, really valuable. And that's how to grow community in diversity. If we can master that, look at all the problems that we would be able to tackle in the world. I'm not saying the Unitarians can tackle those problems, because that would be quite outrageous for me to say that. But it would be, if we can find a way of doing that, bringing people together who don't agree with one another, who don't hold necessarily the same views, that would be something, wouldn't it? Don't you think so? This book goes through a whole range of subjects. If you haven't actually had an opportunity to read it, well, you can purchase a copy somewhere, or I'm sure we might even have a copy in the library here, Louise.
We do, since you've asked. Our Unitarian books from our old building are in the bookcase, which is in the small room over there, and we do have a copy if anyone wants to borrow it.
Yeah, so that's Unitarians Together in Diversity. And it's a very interesting survey. I'm sure Louise can testify to that. It covers everything from God to environment to you name it, all the issues of our day, and how Unitarians individually respond to that. So, I would highly recommend that book, because it's a question. How can university be a strength? Sorry, how can this diversity be a strength? How can it? Well, I believe it can. And I believe it actually is a great strength, because we're not uniform, we're not one colour, we represent more than the natural environment. The Unitarians do and actually represent the world as it is, not as we necessarily think it should be. Would that be a fair assessment? Think about it, that we actually do these things, yeah. But how then do we find Unitarianism being better known? Because it needs to be better known. I would suggest it does need to be better known. It needs to be, it's a good formation of society, a community. When we can love one another and we can be with one another and we can actually hold one another in community, even though that we are very diverse, that's a very powerful tool in our world. And I suggest that we are modeling something that could actually be really valuable and a useful tool for others to follow. Do you think that's possible? I think so. I think so. But a small group of us here and there, and you've got to go a long way to the next Unitarian meeting. Probably next meeting is that Darlington.
Stockton, if you mean the nearest congregation, Stockton and Edinburgh.
Yeah, so a long way. So we're scattered about, little groups here, little groups there throughout the country. But Unitarians at one time there were a lot more Unitarians at one stage. And it's very interesting, but if you know the history of Unitarianism, for Unitarianism means different things to each one of us. But historically, it meant that we were non-Trinitarians. That was where the Unitarian idea came from, that we didn't believe that God was made into three persons. And although most Unitarians would say Jesus is a wonderful divine prophet, teacher, not God. That's where the original Unitarian idea came from, so that we were in unity rather than diversity. And it's very interesting because in the 1500s and 1600s, we were confused with Muslims, because Muslims hold to one God, and Unitarians were thought to be closer to Muslims than they were to Christianity. Isn't that interesting? So that's the historical thing. But those things are not so important to us today. But I would say that Unitarianism for me means bringing everything back into unity, bringing all this diversity back into unity and pulling it back together and making it one. And that's the task that we have to do. Another book, I'm going to suggest another book, Seeking Paradise, a Unitarian Mission for Our Times. Got that one live as well?
Yes, we have.
Yeah, so we're well equipped, aren't we? Now, this is written by Stephen Lingwood. I'm not trying to incidentally, I don't represent the publishers and trying to flog books here, but it's a lovely book because it challenges Unitarians to be more missionary. And I said we were trying to avoid that word missionary because of its implications. But if we've got such good news to offer, then we've got something to say, haven't we? We've got something to say to one another, and we've got something to say to the world. And what stops us saying it? We don't want anything to do with evangelism. We don't want to try and convert people. And that's the last thing that Unitarians want to do, is to convert people. We want them to bring their ideas and their strengths and their view of the world into community with us. And that's really the interesting part. So Stephen's talking about a very interesting, and in the introduction was written by Elizabeth Slade, who's the chief officer of the General Assembly of Unitarians and Free Churches. And she said, I believe that Unitarianism will flourish only if the work of each of us is driven by a clear personal mission and with a sense of loving generosity rather than institutional self-preservation. I think that's a lovely expression, that we're not interested in self-preservation as an organisation. We're not looking at who will do the jobs in our meeting, though I'm sure Louise could do with a little bit of hands occasionally. But we don't look at the person coming through the door and saying, there's a nice day. No. He or she will make a nice secretary or a treasurer. Oh, that looks like a treasurer. It's always an unpopular job to be a treasurer. And we don't look at people like that. We don't think, yes, they will be very useful to us, because that's about institutional self-preservation, isn't it? And we're not interested in self-preservation. And we don't want to grow our numbers just so that we have a bigger congregations. That's not what we're about. We just want to share what we've got and what we're learning and what we learn each day and every service and every time we come together. And I'm learning from you this morning, looking at your eyes and saying, well, how is this working out? Is what I'm saying really sounding into your heart? Is it start here in the brain? Are you disagreeing with me? Are you looking at I'm learning. See, this is a learning process of being in a community, isn't it? When we come together, we learn to be in community. We learn to love one another. I think that's wonderful. Wonderful things that we can do. Can we find a uniting vision, a mission in a time of confusion and complexity? Can we? Can we find a uniting vision? Because if we can, we're onto something. And that something will be very useful to us personally in our personal sense of mission, as Elizabeth talked about there, but also in our coming together, I might say our corporate sense of who we are as well, so that we can say Unitarianism isn't just about what we don't believe, it's about, and I'll use that expression again, maybe that was it, that we are, actually trying out ideas that could be good for society. We're in an experimental situation. We're spiritual experimenters. How about that? That we each time we come together, we're experimenting with one another, finding out about ways, what we can do, what we can't do, how we can live. But there was somebody who did it before us, of course. the man called Jesus of Nazareth, or Rabbi Jesus, or Rabbi Yeshua, the Jewish prophet. In the Gospels, it says this: let me give you a new commandment. You know what's coming next? Love one another. In the same way I loved you, you will love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see the love you have for each other. And I would suggest those words are universal and stand the test of time. They're not controversial, nothing controversial. Very little you can find to disagree with there. It's really there for us to think about. And it's 2,000 years old. Let us love one another, just as I've shown to do. That's what we need to do, and that's what you'll be recognised. Whether we call ourselves Christian or not Christian, doesn't matter. Those principles still hold good. So we have a lot to celebrate together, a lot to be with one another together. And I hope you will take that away, that we are here to experiment a new society, if you like, a new way of being together. And that's something that we can think about. So can we have a time, just a little silence, just to reflect on what we've said together this morning, reflect on where we are, anything that's going on in our lives that we need to just spend a moment in silence. We can just do that and settle into a nice breathing, and just quietly close our eyes or not, just to relax and find our true center. For a moment, we hold in our hearts those who are suffering this morning. Those who are bearing the unbearable circumstances of war and poverty. Those who have to sleep in doorways in our centres. Hold in our hearts our world. Our environment, our creatures who are suffering because of human activity. Wonder what love can do, what we can do with love in our small ways, in our families and friends, in our wider associates. A benediction at the end of our time. Be kind, be brave, be just, be merciful, be hopeful. This is how we keep the chalice flame burning until we are together again to light it anew. And that was written by Adam Slate. So let us keep our flame burning bright in the dark time that we're in. Winter time is always a dark time, isn't it? It's a time of reflection too.